Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. Terry Gallagher. I want to welcome you to another edition of Come and See, where we look at hope for the future that's found at the intersection of faith and technology when our faith guides our use of technology rather than our greed. So, following up on the previous episode, we're still in my office and we're having another Come to Terry difficult truth discussion. And this time we're going to focus in on nuclear power. Nuclear power generation. Is it positive, or is it negative, or is it somewhere in between? I entered into this conversation recognizing that there's a huge disagreement among us, among not only science in general, but among environmentalists, ethicists, and people who are struggling fiercely for the future of our children in response to the climate crisis. Nuclear power. First of all, a quick lesson. All right? Nuclear power at one time was thought to be the save-all. It was going to be an answer to all of humankind's needs because it's an endless source of power, at least at first glance. But there are problems that are associated as we know that. But let's take a quick look at it. We can talk about nuclear reactors in 4 different evolutions. All right? Generation 1 were built in the 1950s, and they're pretty well gone from the face of the earth. They no longer exist. They weren't all that long lasted, and they were difficult to control, and they had significant risks with them. Generation 2 is the most common reactor that's currently in operation. It uses water to control the rate of the reaction of the nuclear elements. And so it's very critical that there be a continuous supply of water. That's why when you go past a nuclear power plant, one of the first things that you see, the nuclear reactor building itself is small, but there's these huge cooling towers. And they're cooling the water that cools the water that cools the reactor. So you have a closed containment system where the nuclear reaction is taking place with control rods. They're submerged or emerged out of water to control the rate of it. That water is contaminated by nuclear radiation, and so it goes into a heat exchanger where other water on the other side of the metal barriers of the heat exchanger cools that. And it's really important that you have that continuous cooling cycle, because without it, you have what we call a runaway reaction or a meltdown. That's level 2. That's what you'll find most across the world. In fact, in Illinois, we have so many of them, we would be the number 6 country in the world with our nuclear reactors. One benefit Illinois has, because that is a very cheap power base, at least for right now, if you don't count the total cost. So that's level 2. Level 3 is currently under development and is being rolled out. There's 5 functioning plants, mostly in China, with a few more slated to come on. They institute greater safeguards, fail-safe modes into the level 2 design. So level 3 doesn't require pumped water because it's going to have its water vertically above it. So in the event of water pump failure, you don't have a runaway reaction. You still have water that can circulate it. But you still have all the other potential problems of nuclear power, radiation, and waste disposal. Number 4, generation number 4, is the hope for the future. There's small fusion reactors. Some are talking about going to the chemistry of thorium, and I won't go into that. But the idea is they use almost complete fuel usage, so they regenerate their fuel, and so you don't have this large waste disposal problem with nuclear fuel, right? And thorium is a much more present radioactive element in the world than what's currently used in nuclear reactors, so there's no concern about running out of the supply of it. Nuclear power is strongly advocated by some of our leading climate scientists. In fact, our 4 leading climate scientists went on record last year and said nuclear power is absolutely necessary and critical to solving the climate crisis, principally because there's no carbon dioxide pollution that comes from nuclear power. And so they strongly advocated overcoming what they consider the irrational prejudice against nuclear power. All right, here's where we differ. As a Christian ethicist, I don't think it's irrational prejudice. I think it's, and as an engineer, realistic conclusions after the disasters that we've had. In my youth, there was 3 Mile Island. And then in the 80s, there was Chernobyl in the Ukraine and Russia area, which, by the way, they didn't tell anybody about until Norway asked, why are the radiation counters going nuts? And of course, a couple years ago, there was Fukushima, where a nuclear power plant located on the shore of Japan got its power systems wiped out by a huge tsunami wave coming in after an earthquake, which took out the power, which of course shut down the cooling water pumps, which then resulted in a runaway reaction of 3, if not 4, of the reactors, and a total contamination of that section of Japan and some of the ocean for nuclear radiation for generations to come. When I think of nuclear power, I can't not think of the Revelations verse where I behold a pale horse, and on that horse was death. Nuclear power has untold risks, and it's not just the meltdown, it's also the waste. Nuclear power plants, particularly Generation 2 plants which populate the Earth right now, have a tremendous nuclear waste problem. They don't use that much of their fuel, and so most of their fuel comes out in waste, and that waste has a minimum 10,000 year hazardous waste problem. 10,000 years that waste is deadly. I once testified to the Nuclear Regulatory Board, and I told a large gathering of engineers who had been touting about they have the answer by having these super containment vessels that would control the nuclear waste and keep it safe for 10,000 years, that's total hubris. As an engineer and as a plant manager, I can't begin to count the number of times where we thought we had an answer and a few years later found out there were problems that we did not foresee with that answer. To think that we could stay right now, that we have an answer that's going to last 10,000 years is complete foolishness. Right? So another answer they have is buried in a mountain. You got to ask yourself, what would we think of the Egyptians if the Egyptians had buried their hazardous waste in the pyramids, so that when we opened up the pyramids, millions of people died? We need to think this through. The climate scientists that are strongly advocating for nuclear power, those 4 leading ones, I have tremendous respect for. And I fully understand their concern that renewable energy, as I talked about in the last episode, to go 100% is challenging. But it's a challenge that does not involve a 10,000 year hazardous waste problem. I would much rather deal with the inconvenience of having additional wind power and additional photovoltaic cells powering from the sun than having a waste problem that lasts 10,000 years. In the Gospel of John, when Jesus is about to leave his disciples, he says, I still have truth to tell you, but you cannot bear it now. So the advocate, the Holy Spirit, will come and bring this knowledge to you. We're still in a time where we're wrestling over what's the answer to the climate crisis. There's lots of answers, but surely we can choose one that doesn't place another great risk on our kids and grandkids and their kids and their grandkids and their kids and their grandkids. Nuclear power. There may well come a time where that Generation 4, which has minimal waste, small scalability, becomes practical and the hazards are acceptable. We're not there yet. I don't doubt that the future power demands, as it continues to grow, we're going to have to come up with some combination of that. But we should resist that with all our might until there's no other option. That's my 2 cents. It's critical that our faith guide our use of technology so that we don't just choose the expedient, easy answers, the profit-making answers, but we choose the answers that are right for our kids and our grandkids and the generations to come. Can we do this? As a Christian pastor, I continuously am astounded by the insights that God's Spirit will bring to us if we're but open to Him. And this is one of those. We can do this without risking our kids. See you next time on Come and See, where we'll explore another hope for the future that comes out of technology that's guided by our faith. And I won't be behind a desk, I promise you. We'll be out and looking at things that we can do right now, just you and I. Take care.
And faith is not in knowing, it's a willingness to learn. And faith is found in loving when there's nothing in return. So come and see, around the bend, look my friend, and what could be? Come with me, come with me. There's so much more to know, so come and see. There's so much more to know, so come and see.